Everyone for joining us tonight, and on behalf of the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies, I want to welcome you. My name is Evelyn Blumenberg, and this is the second part in our Transportation is a Women's Issue series. It's really nice to see everyone come out on an evening, even though it's a lovely day here in winter in Los Angeles. So at ITS, kind of in addition to producing what we kind of consider rigorous, relevant, and respected research, we also really have a role in convening people and having the opportunity to really talk about issues that are important and timely. And personally, I think talking about the gendered nature of our transportation system is something that's could have been looked at a long time ago, but it's a great opportunity that was something that's kind of drawing attention now, and that we're having an opportunity to kind of discuss about this topic. So, this is why we're using kind of our ability to bring you all together to really highlight some of the progress that's going on, the initiatives happening in Los Angeles, and to kind of ground it a little bit about travel behavior and what we know about how women get around. Tonight's event, which is not coincidentally planned on the eve of International Women's Day,
Yay!
So features what I consider an all-star lineup of wonderful women. One of our ITS faculty fellows, one of our ITS advisory board members, and two partners from great organizations here in Los Angeles. So I want to thank Investing in Place for helping us also with childcare with my first footsteps tonight.
Yay.
So we can really have thank you for that. Not just talk about this, but actually make an opportunity for not just having to figure out another kind of schlepping part of it. So tonight we're going to, I'm just going to walk through a little bit what we're going to do tonight. We're going to have a moderated discussion, and I'll introduce our moderator and panelists. Then we'll have an opportunity for Q&A, and then we'll have some snacks and a chance to kind of debrief and talk in the garden, which is a perfect evening for it. So let me just introduce our speakers and moderator, and then we'll get started. So to my right here, Naomi Iwasaki is the Deputy Director of Investing in Place. She'll be our moderator tonight. She has deep connections both to social justice and Los Angeles, and really, I think part of what the excellence of Investing in Place is doing is kind of experience translating community perspectives into real policy and projects. To her right is Seleta Reynolds, and Seleta is the General Manager of the Los Angeles Department of Transportation. She oversees the Transportation Department and works to improve and expand access to integrated transportation choices, both for Los Angeles and our region. To her right is Professor Evelyn Blumenberg, who is a Professor of Urban Planning at the UCLA Department and UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs and a faculty fellow at the Institute of Transportation Studies. Her research focuses on economic outcomes for low-wage workers and the travel of the poor and immigrants, and we'll hear a lot about that this evening. And last but not least is Stephanie Wiggins. Stephanie is the Deputy Executive Director for LA Metro, where she oversees an ever-expanding public transportation network and was part of the instrumental success in Metro's Express Lanes program. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to our speakers and moderator tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Maddie, and thank you to UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies for hosting this event. It's really exciting. As Maddie said, my name is Naomi Iwasaki. I'm the Deputy Director at Investing in Place. We are a transportation policy and finance advocacy nonprofit that works across LA County. I've worked in transportation for almost 15 years, and it's nice to be in a female-dominated transportation conversation right now on a female-strong panel. And I know I'm not the headliner, so I'm very excited to move quickly into letting the panelists introduce themselves. So I will start to my right with Seleta.
Great. Oh, we're doing self-introduction.
Oh, yes, self.
Great.
If you could please introduce yourself.
No problem.
Professional affiliation,
So Seleta
color.
Reynolds, rhymes with Velveeta. That will help you remember it. And I'm the General Manager of LADOT. Previously, I was up in San Francisco at the SFMTA. I've been in LA for the last 3.5 years. And LADOT is a big organization, 2,000 people, manage and operate 7,500 miles of streets, 37,000 parking meters, 4,500 signalized intersections. And we have just put out our new strategic plan, Great Streets for Los Angeles, an update which really focuses our work around building safe, beautiful streets, managing people's mobility as they get around Los Angeles, and making LADOT a great place to work. The other hat that I wear is the president of the National Association of City Transportation Officials, who represent 64 of the largest American cities, plus a couple of transit agencies, including Metro, and really proud to sort of lead that organization and the work that they do. And I have to say, we had a hug-related incident here earlier. And so our proximity is not a reflection of how we see LADOT working closely with both the worlds of academia and our partners at Metro.
Thank you for explaining.
It is purely a pants-related practical consideration.
Hi everyone, I'm Evelyn Blumenberg. I'm a faculty member in urban planning in the Luskin School of Public Affairs, which is all information that Maddie just shared with you. UCLA, I don't have some fancy thing to say about UCLA, it's the public university. Yeah, go, thank you. Go, maybe we can do an 8 clap or something. Anyway, it's a public university on the west side of town, and Maddie said I do work on the travel of immigrants and the poor, although tonight I'm not going to be talking about that so much. I'm going to be talking about women in travel.
Nice. Fight on. I'm Stephanie Wiggins. Oh yeah. Good evening. Stephanie Wiggins, Deputy CEO at LA Metro. Proud to be on this panel. Most of you know about Metro. We're one of the largest transportation agencies in the country. We have about 11,000 employees. About 29% of our workforce is female. And in my role as the deputy, not only do I oversee the day-to-day activities of the organization, I also oversee our audit, procurement, security, congestion reduction departments. And one of my latest roles is really serving as the lead facilitator for our brand new Women and Girls Governing Council that our CEO authorized last fall, before Me Too officially. So I hope to talk about some of our activity this evening.
Thank you, everyone. So thank you, everyone, for coming. We're really excited to be talking about women in transportation being a women's issue. And it is really exciting to see this leadership of women growing in the transportation planning and provider world. But of course, women have been using transportation systems since there were transportation systems. So I'd love to hear from some of the panelists. What are some considerations that we see female travelers sharing when making travel decisions, or perhaps when being denied transportation choices? And I'm gonna start with the doctor. Thank you.
I didn't bring my prescription pad, but what I thought, I hope I can twist this a little bit and it will come back around to your question, is I thought that I would start by talking just a little bit about sex differences in travel behavior, just to ground some of the discussion, because the other panelists are going to be much better suited to talking about particular kinds of programs that they're all involved in and the services that they provide. Just a couple of minutes on some of the explanations for some of these differences in travel behavior. And then just from my very lofty academic perspective, thinking about what we might be able to do about it. And my orders were to do all of this in less than 5 minutes, and I do entire lectures on all of this. So let's see. And I'm not going to try to talk that fast. I'm going to try to keep it short and not get caught up in the weeds. But you can catch me if I do that. Okay. So first, let me just talk just a little bit about sex differences based on the data. Okay. So straight from the data. In terms of travel mode, and I think we'll be talking a lot about, cars and transit and bikes and walking, women and men, at least right now, travel very similarly. Okay, so the travel mode is very similar for all trips and also for work trips. There are some subtle differences. I won't get into them because that's getting into the weeds, but in general, the mode is pretty similar. But it is important to know that it hasn't always been this way. So women used to rely on transit a lot more than men, and it's only fairly recently where that gap has narrowed. Okay, so right now on the mode front, women and men travel very similarly. One of the big differences is trip distance. Okay, so for all trips and for commute trips, women are traveling fewer miles than men. Okay, and so that's pretty consistent. That difference is narrowed over time, but it's still substantial. So I'm going to come back to that. Women and men also travel to different places. Okay, so when we talk about trip purpose, they're traveling to different places. They make fewer work trips. They make more household serving trips, and I'll come back to that as well. And then finally, there's an issue of trips complexity. So women are making a lot more complex trips. They're doing a lot of trip chaining, sort of multiple trips on a single tour, right? And a lot of that to and from work. Okay. A few words on why some of these differences exist. And this is where I'm talking about sex differences. This is where we start to talk about gender differences that are really important. So when we're talking about gender, we're moving away from these biological distinctions. We're turning to some of the characteristics of society or culture and how they associate characteristics with particular sexes. And that certainly happens in the arena of transportation as well as labor markets and on and on. So, for example, cars historically have been associated with men, okay? They're a symbol of power. They're a symbol of autonomy. They're a symbol of men's ability to handle large and complicated machinery, okay? So you can go, and I'm certain that you all have seen, the car ads are unbelievable. Yeah. So just Google those car ads and look at, gender and car ads. They're pretty amazing. And I've got one quote for you about that, is that one of the early ads for automatic transmissions includes a picture of a woman, and the quote on the ad is, "I know the secret of learning to drive. It's as simple as ABC when there's only 2 pedals to concentrate on." So the whole message, right? So women can just concentrate on 2 pedals, right? Okay, so, but there's a whole, people have done, sort of a lot of writing on this. There's a whole long history about the association with technology and cars in particular, and men. So why do we still have these sex differences in travel? Well, we still have a gender division of labor in the household and in the labor market. We've seen, huge increases. If I could bring in my slides, right? You look at female labor force participation, huge increase in women working in the labor market, married women working in the labor market, women with kids in the labor market, women with young kids in the labor market. And in most households, women now work, and they also have the disproportionate responsibility for the unpaid labor in the home. It's really hard to carry out those multiple tasks using public transit or using a bike or walking. It's really difficult. Most people do not, and there are many studies on this, most people don't do those kinds of activities. Work, for example, even shopping, there's a recent study on, they don't do those kinds of things in their immediate neighborhood, and so they have to travel. Out of curiosity, I used Google to figure out, I had 2 kids, 2 schools, what it would take for me to use transit to get my kids to their 2, luckily their schedules were staggered, so to the 2 schools and get up to UCLA. And it would take me 2 hours and 20 minutes to do that on public transit, assuming that everything went smoothly. I just completed a study looking at 2-parent households with 1 automobile. So the whole focus was on gender. How to figure out in a household where there's competition for the car, who gets sort of use of the car. And we found that the person that had the most responsibilities, both on the employment and on the household side, they would get use of the car. And since women had most of those responsibilities, women, we called it monopolizing the vehicle. Women were monopolizing the vehicle. The unexpected finding is we looked at, well, what were the men doing? Well, what do you think the men were doing? Who said driving? Driving. A lot of the men were driving. I mean, we don't know where they were getting the cars, but they were getting a vehicle and they were driving around, right? And so I'll come back to that. I'm only going to say a couple more things. So on the shorter commutes, there's not great explanations. We still don't know why women have shorter commutes, whether it's something that they choose to do to manage those complex responsibilities. So you can see where that would be a possibility. It also could be because of the kinds of jobs. There's a labor market explanation for that as well, the kinds of jobs that they get. And then there are issues related to safety, and I know how many of you were here at the previous panel on women and safeties. Okay, so there was a few of you. So that's not my field of expertise. I'm not going to talk about safety, but safety is an important issue. Just a few more comments. So what are the implications for thinking about sort of planning and transportation? Some of you I know my rap on this already because you were students in my classes. Cars have to be in the mix. I mean, there's no question about it. Given the sort of complexity of the tours that most women are making, okay, certainly cars have to be part of the mix. And then we can think about, and I'm sure we're going to come back to this, whether it's car ownership or car access, right? So those are all things we can talk about. But I do want to, this is my feminist plug here that I'm concerned about, that there's no question that cars make it easier for women to juggle work and non-work responsibilities. But the question that we need to ask is whether we want to encourage that, right? So on one hand, we want to ease the burden that women face in trying to do all this complicated travel, to juggle work, to juggle household responsibilities. On the other hand, there's certainly a concern that I have, and I'm curious about your thoughts about this, that in doing that, my car thing, we're inadvertently reinforcing women's disproportionate responsibility for unpaid household work. And that is the root of the problem, right? So it's a very thorny sort of problem. Ultimately, we have to adopt a set of policies, not necessarily transportation policies, to help undermine that division of labor in the household. So that's not what you all are here to talk about. I'm not going to talk about that so much, but it is really an important part of the mix, and it's not an easy task, clearly. And then my last insight from this study on the sharing of the one household car is that we ought to allow those who have really complicated travel patterns to have access to an automobile. And we really need to think about how we encourage and enhance all those sort of transportation alternatives for the partner that has the simple, right, the less complicated. So that's a niche. We shouldn't have all those men taking all those car trips, okay, when many of those trips are very simple trips and could be taken by other modes. Okay, that's it for me. Did I even touch on the question that you asked? Probably not.
I think that was an excellent frame of what we're talking about, and you definitely dropped a lot of information and data that will be helpful to refer to. I was taking notes, definitely. Stephanie, can I kick it over to you as the Deputy CEO of Metro, who wears a lot of hats, you personally and the agency, but probably what the agency is most known for is being the transit provider for the County of Los Angeles, both with rail and with bus. And based on some of the data and information that Dr. Blumenberg just shared with us, have you seen in your sort of overseeing of operations the differences in how women and men travel? Particularly, it seems like when parenthood becomes a factor, that's really where we see the divergent characteristics of travel behavior.
Well, actually at Metro, we've only seen it anecdotally. We can only talk about it anecdotally because as the professor outlined, one of the issues that we've actually been intentional about in looking at how we plan our service, the service we provide, really applying a gender lens to that. We've only started doing it over the last 6 months, and what we discovered is we don't collect the data. Or when we do collect the data, we don't analyze the data. And so that's a big issue. And we've even been talking to Seleta, because she can talk about the initiative she's launching countywide. Our Women and Girls Council did this assessment, scanned the agency, and of all of the different planning products that we produce and our onboard surveys, I think they inventoried about 14 different major planning initiatives, and maybe only one of them looked at analyzing the gender data. So one of the recommendations that our council made to our CEO that he just approved last month is for us to actually begin to gather gender disaggregated data and then hire a consultant to help us fill in the gaps so that we can develop a gender action plan. Because I think the professor is exactly right. What we're seeing is that women make fewer trips, but our planning has always been gender neutral. And, they say, what gets measured gets done, and we haven't been measuring it at all, and it's been lost. And why is it such a critical point for us? Today, about 55% of our bus ridership is female. About 47% of our rail ridership is female. And since 2014, we've lost 21 million boardings on our system. So all of us across the nation are having this ridership decline, but it's really significant at Metro. And when you think about the fact that we're embarking on our next generation bus study, where we're really revisiting the entire bus network, we've got to make sure that we don't use the planning tools of the past to help inform the planning for the future. And so this recommendation that our council made to our CEO, now we'll be able to apply it to that next gen study, because they weren't going to look at gender movements as part of the study, because we thought, we could pay equal attention to gender and there won't be a difference in how people travel, and we're realizing that's not the case.
Right. The equality doesn't mean that people need to be treated differently, but just fairly, right? So I think that that's a nuance that is exciting to see popping up more in transportation planning. What Seleta would love to hear about the initiative that Stephanie referred to, and then I think something that I just admire about you personally is being a mom and the GM of LADOT. You ride the bus to work, and you take your daughters on the bus, and I think that's awesome. So I just want to shout that out. If you want to talk about that too, you can. If you don't, it's personal, my bad. And leave that up to you.
You're right, I'm super closed. Don't overshare ever. No, I appreciate that, and I was going to comment that the reason why I'm able to do all of that is that my husband is a stay-at-home dad, and we are a two-parent household with one car, and that car is completely dominated by the member of the household that makes the most complicated trips. In this case, my husband. But and I'm not driving. I'm either on the bus or I'm on my bike, and then when I can, I take my daughters on the bus, and they love it. It's a huge adventure for them. They don't have to get strapped into, we call it the Iron Maiden, in the back seat of a vehicle. They're free, and they get to look out the window, and it's a huge treat for them, an experience for them to ride public transit. And so thank you, Metro, for giving us that, amazing number 2 and number 4 line up Sunset. Just shouting that out. Don't change that service. We really dig it. And it is we've been able to make it work. I mean, when I moved down here from the Bay Area, I very much did not want to buy a second vehicle. That was sort of one of the criteria that we had. And so we've been able to make it work, but it really is enabled by the fact that we have options like Uber and Lyft and bike sharing and car sharing and transit, and it does require this full spectrum of things that includes cars, right? I'm not driving those cars, but they absolutely have to be a part of that mix. So I mentioned the strategic plan before. We had a strategic plan that took us from 2014 to 2017, and we needed to re-up it. And when we were re-upping it, I was giving a lot of thought to just some of the conversations I've been having and the things that I've observed in particular about the design of the system, who designs it, who it works for, and who it doesn't work for, and whether or not women were really being considered, and families and children were really being considered in the way the system is designed. And I think that you can look at, just to pick on one obvious example, the history of bike design in the United States, and see this very, very gendered story of how we came to have the design handbooks that we have, the networks that we have. From 1950 to 1970 in the US, we were busying ourselves building freeways, but there was a huge explosion in cycling in the early 70s. And Davis, California really led the way in building out this bike network that really worked. And they were able to demonstrate that not only were more people riding, but it was safer. And so the US started moving towards what are called separated bikeways, right? Where you're riding a bike, but you actually have some buffering between you and traffic. And there was a guy at the time named John Forrester in Palo Alto, California, who felt very threatened, along with a lot of other club cyclists, that this was going to be a way of kicking bicyclists off of public roads. And so he and his colleagues did a lot of work to malign a lot of the really great research about separated bikeways, and then also, for lack of a better word, penetrated the sort of world of bicycle design writing, and wrote sort of this document, the seminal document in 1978, which was the Caltrans Bike Design Manual, that became really the marching orders for bike design in this country, premised on the fact that bicyclists should behave like vehicles, and that we should not separate them from traffic, but that you should have to ride along with cars as though you were a car. And that dominated the way we designed our systems in this country for decades and decades. And until about 2007, 2008, when we had the first separated bikeway that had been built in this country in 40 years. And what we know from research from amazing researchers like Jennifer Dill at Portland State is that women in particular prefer separation between themselves and motor vehicle traffic, and they actually prefer quieter streets and will go out of their way to use those facilities. So when we think about who's biking and who's not biking, and in most American cities it's 3/4 men, 1/4 women, absolutely that has to do with the design of the system and the rule book being written by very strong, very capable white men, right? And so, in being in sort of the bike design and planning world for most of my 20-year career, I thought, we've got to, as we look around at not just our bike system, but all our systems, and how they're designed to serve a 9-to-5 commute for mostly white-collar workers who were mostly men, up until women's real entry into the labor market. We've got to at least start to unpack that and see if we can't change that, because we've trapped women in particular to one choice that feels safe and comfortable and works for them because of the design of the system. So in our new strategic plan, we have an effort underway to first understand the needs of women and families in Los Angeles, and then to focus directly on pilot projects and other things, small and large, that we can do to really meet those needs. And so first and foremost, we're going to try and boil that problem down to focus on, in particular, after-school transportation needs. So we used to have a really robust transportation system for schools. As schools lost money over decades, the transportation system was gutted and gutted and gutted. And now the burden of that responsibility falls mostly on the household and mostly on women to sort of arrange and figure out those trips. So we're starting with that. But in the meantime, we're not waiting for that work to be done to see if we can question and dig deeper on programs we currently have. So we're getting ready to launch an EV car sharing program around MacArthur Park. And one of the things we did was a lot of focus group work to understand the needs of the people in that community and the women and families in that community. So we heard things like, I can't use this service if there are no child seats available to me. And I want to be able to add my mother's caregiver onto our family's account, because the caregiver can't afford to have her own account, but if I can get her on my account, she can help my mom get to doctor's appointments and go pick up groceries, and I won't have to do those things anymore, which will free me up to go work, to take classes, to take care of my kids, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there are simple things we can do now, and Stephanie is sort of mentioning, how about we just ask the question? But then we also need to think much bigger and figure out, what are some of the more fundamental ways we can change the design of our system to meet the needs of, half of the people who are using it.
Thank you. And thank you for also bringing up safety. And I know, Doctor, you said that, this, and everyone on this panel, I don't think would self-proclaim to be a safety expert, but I think it's hard to talk about women traveling and not talk about safety, or at least perceptions of safety, both traffic safety and personal visible safety. And especially when we talk about active transportation or public transportation, where it is this shared space, there is more exposure. And so, I'm hearing that we don't have a ton of data on this, and that seems to be a running theme that we'll probably come back to time and time again this evening. I guess anecdotally, what sort of concerns are we hearing about safety, both traffic and personal, from women travelers, and what does that mean for what kind of data we should be collecting or we should be analyzing, and trying to use to make our systems more comprehensive and serve all 100% of the population?
Well, I'll share one little data point that we do have, because we've been doing a ton of work looking at crashes in the city of LA over the last few years, and what we found is that men between the ages of 18 and 40 are predominantly the drivers in crashes that result in severe and fatal outcomes for people biking and walking. Now, that may be because men are doing most of the driving. We don't have that, I'll caveat that, we don't have that control. But, it's true that sort of, driving and it has this sort of gendered aspect to it, but the outcomes on the street are extraordinarily negative. And so I don't think we're going to be able to stop issuing driver's licenses to men between the ages of That was a joke. Please do not tweet that the general manager of LADOT is suggesting that. But until then, men are very much an audience for safety messages and thinking about how we talk about the enormous responsibility of driving a car in Los Angeles.
Well, we have looked at safety from two areas. I mean, first and foremost, it's the sexual harassment that goes on the system. That's a major deterrent for ridership on our system and a major concern of ours. So not only have we partnered with Peace Over Violence for a number of initiatives on our anti-harassment campaign, and working with our law enforcement partners to ensure that they're sensitive and their presence is meaningful. And that was really important because when we recently conducted a survey, I think now it's about a couple of years old, we surveyed folks who'd left our system within a 2-year period, and their number one reason given for leaving our system was concerns about safety and security on board the system. And we know that's a significant issue for women. But the second area that we're beginning to look at, and again, this came out of our council, and I know our planning department is looking into this issue, it's really the design, right? The system design, the way the cars are designed, the way the buses are designed, do they accommodate strollers? It's a fascinating, oh my goodness, I can't believe I'm about to complete the sentence. It's fascinating topic about the different way rail cars are designed. I need another life. But, and there are some that, in terms of, how close people are to one another, that, invite, unwanted interaction with folks versus others. So we want to be more conscious and intentional about that. And we've even begun talking about really having a gender lens on our design checklists for all of infrastructure, our bus stops, where people are waiting, how we design the station. So I think there are things that we can be, again, more intentional about to address women's needs.
So having said that I don't do work on safety, I'm now going to say just a few words about safety. So you were talking about rail cars. Certainly those issues are on cars as well. And so there have been a number of studies looking at the car technology and that it is built, the safety features in the car are really built around a male standard, the airbag, the seat belts, all of that. So I think that seems like it permeates our technology. On the safety side, and again, I've not done this research, so that's the caveat, but there's also a lot of safety issues around. We talked about being on the bus and concerns about being on transit, but a huge concern about walking to the bus stop, right, and waiting for the bus. And that is particularly important if we want to address these issues of off-peak service, okay? So it is true, this is the data I have looked on, most people travel during the peak. That's true for women, it's true for low-wage workers. The lion's share travel during the peak, which is why everybody's concerned about congestion, right? Because everybody's traveling in the same period of time. But lower income workers are more likely than higher income workers to travel off-peak. But we've held focus groups, there's a lot of concern. I remember this was a focus group we held in Alameda County. The community was up in arms, they wanted night and weekend service to the airport. And so they got federal funds to implement night and weekend service to the airport. And how many people were riding those buses in the middle of the night? Most of the people didn't want to be hanging out at the bus stop in the middle of the night, okay? So we have to address some of those safety concerns if we want transit to be the solution to sort of night and sort of work schedules that are atypical, right? So.
And I think it's worthy of just unpacking a little bit as we look towards the future. I mean, I don't know, I end up on a lot of panels where I'll be sitting next to somebody who's talking about how amazing it's going to be when transit is dirt cheap because you won't have to pay for the labor anymore because you'll have a driverless bus, or because you'll have a driverless robo-taxi, right, where you'll be paired with other people and you'll pick this up and you'll roll around towards this utopian future. And I always have to pump the brakes. I am not going to feel comfortable, and neither are most of the women whom I know getting onto any kind of vehicle with strangers without a chaperone. That's right. And that is a really overlooked value and quality that a transit operator brings and even in an Uber or a Lyft, that having that driver there, it's a reputational system, and that it gives you a higher level of confidence about signing up for a carpool service like Lyft Line or Uber Pool. And so this idea that somehow we're going to have is just perpetuating this centering on a very male way of thinking about moving through space, and the confidence and sort of impunity that many men have, not all men, but many men have, as they move through the world, versus the perspective of most women who feel like we move through the world always on guard about sexual harassment or assault. And so, I think that's important if you hear people start speaking that way, to try and push back on that a little bit. That there are, if we want to design a future system that's going to correct for some of these mistakes, it can't be we're going to do that by getting rid of the labor and making it really cheap.
Thank you. Yes, I think one of the topics we wanted to talk about today is the future of transportation and these new innovative treatments and ideas like microtransit and automated vehicles, even rideshare and bike share as they expand and become more popular. And I think one practice is having women in leadership positions and on panels and being part of the conversation to pump the brakes when the considerations of travelers who are female are not perhaps centered in the conversation. Are there other practices or research strategies or funding strategies or planning practices maybe from other countries that are a little more advanced in this comprehensive transportation world than us that we can look to better plan for the future?
I mean, I think I'm sure there are other places that are doing a better job. And when you look at the way that some of the networks are designed in other countries, you can see that there is a lot more consideration given to things like lighting and personal safety, or just improving being very attentive to the perception of safety. There's real safety, and then there's the perception of safety. And I think that they're equally important when you're talking about people making different choices and how they get around. But I think that, the funding strategies and sort of funding formulas that have really underwritten transportation, particularly in California, have been very much about reducing congestion during the peak. And a lot of the funding that flows to not just Los Angeles, but a lot of major cities in California is aimed at emissions reduction, which of course needs to aim at congestion reduction, which then aims at the peak. And if what you are solving for is the peak, then you're never going to have a system that has reliable, frequent, comfortable service during the times of day when women need it most. And it's never going to take into consideration the complexity of trip chaining, because there's going to be a sort of a hardwired incentive for cities to try and fix peak hour congestion. And by doing so, improving and increasing peak hour transit service. And I don't mean to say that those are bad things and that we shouldn't be doing that. I just mean to say that as a result, we have an extraordinarily lopsided system. And so I would love to see sort of future funding formulas aimed more at equity outcomes, which I think would get us to gender outcomes in a roundabout way, but also encompass the needs of all folks who don't feel comfortable in those situations. I mean, I think there are a lot of vulnerable populations who don't feel comfortable making their way to a dark bus stop and sitting there for any extended period of time, not just women, right? And there are a lot of populations that would love an easy way to on and off board, a stroller, a push cart, a walker, a wheelchair, on and off of a transit vehicle without it being a huge production that puts the attention on them and inconveniences everybody else on the bus, right? So I think that there are formula sort of funding that could help us with that. The other major way we've funded transportation in California is through development and development agreements. That's an area where cities have a lot more ability to influence the things we are measuring and the outcomes we are solving for. And I think we have an opportunity to do that, and the state is allowing us to step away from level of service in that analysis, and it's up to us to bring into our threshold some of these considerations.
Yeah, I agree with Seleta. I would just add, first, in terms of around, on a global perspective, I know Transport for London has produced a gender action plan that really, I think, is a model for all transit agencies. I do think, I want to underscore one of Seleta's point about the funders. When the federal government, when the state, when they make as a criteria or establish as a criteria, how many riders you're going to carry or dealing with the peak, that's where people drive their planning towards. So part of what has to happen to be ready for this future, this great future we're supposed to have with all of these new ways of traveling, we've got to educate our funders. We need research from even UCLA, USC and others, and UCLA. But we need that because our federal partners will listen to academia before they'll listen to all of us. So I want to really do a pitch for academia and getting more research out there, really. And I know TRB, Therese McMillan, our Chief Planning Officer, is on a TRB committee on women's issues, and there's going to be a major summit, I think, in early 2019 right here in Southern California. So I want to make a pitch on the federal. But I also want to say, I've discovered over the last 6 months working on our Women and Girls Council that what's really going to be critical for making a difference is to really focus on a gender-balanced workforce. We need women at the table when these decisions are being made. And while it's very important to have women in the top leadership roles like Seleta is in, we need the women who are actually at the table doing service scheduling, making these decisions. I asked our team lead for our next gen bus study, show me all the team, who's on all the team. It's all men, right? And so I talked to him about what the women and girls are working on. He's like, next day, he's called me up. He's adding women to his team. But I really think it's not a quota thing. It's the voice, the experience, the perspective that women can bring. And it's not that we need all women, because we need the male perspective too, but we have to strive for a gender balanced workforce and all of these key areas when these planning decisions are made.
Okay, some random, I'm going to get back to the technology. I think it was a question about sort of new technology and new services, and I'll talk about that. So just one thing to add about the commute. So 16% of all trips are commute trips, okay? So most trips and most travel is for non-work purposes, okay? So the problem is that a lot of those trips happen in a very narrow time band, which is what I said before, and so that complicates things. So now I'm edging on into my work that I do on low-income travelers. So if we want, and I think it is really important, if we want to incentivize other kinds of trips on transit during non-peak hours, we need to provide a financial incentive to do that, okay? And having discounted fares at off-peak hours is a very tangible thing that we can do that would improve equity. A lot of those trips are made by women and low-income men, low-income travelers during the middle of the day. And so that is a really important thing. It's something tangible that we can do. I think that autonomous, I don't know that I've been to any kind of session like this when autonomous vehicles hasn't come up. In fact, I was counting at the Transportation Research Board conference just how many sessions are on autonomous vehicles. And it is a very sexy topic, and I had no idea how it relates. I mean, I maybe these concerns, I think, Seleta's concern about, getting into a car with other riders and nobody, no drive, that may be true. But I think that at this point, at least from my perspective, all the sessions that I've been are just so highly speculative, maybe not on the technology side where they're, kind of working the technology out, but on the planning side, I think that, we ought to be thinking these things through, but at this point it seems very speculative. Then one other thing about ride hailing, which seems to also be another thing where there's lots of conference sessions on. I think that, I know that there's a concern about the relationship between ride hailing and transit use. And I think that what we need to do is start thinking, just think about what I said about women in travel. We need to start thinking very creatively about the role that ride hailing can play. So imagine, let's go back to the gender stuff. Imagine that you're going to the grocery store, okay? So on the way to the grocery store, there's no reason why you couldn't walk, and there's no reason why you couldn't take transit, okay? But getting back, if you go, if you're doing a big shop at a grocery store where there's fresh produce and all of the things that we're concerned about in terms of health, it's likely that you need a vehicle to do that. And if you hang out in a lot of communities at the grocery store, you see a lot of taxis around those supermarkets, okay? So people get there walking, biking, transit, and they use some kind of car to get their groceries home, okay? And so I think that there's a lot of fear around sort of all the ride-hailing services, and I understand where that's coming from, but we also need to think about how we can both encourage alternative transportation, at the same time a niche role for ride-hailing, I think, is going to play an important role.
Well, if we had some of their data, we wouldn't be so scared, because we'd know what in the hell is going on in our streets.
That's true.
And, UC Davis finally came out with a working paper that had a bunch of data from a bunch of American cities, including, I'm sorry, just to throw another UC in here. I'm not from California, so I don't really care. Including Los Angeles. And the conclusions from that were very much that apart from heavy commuter rail, that those companies are pulling trips off of almost every other form of public transit. And furthermore, from some studies from New York, which is the only city that seems to have the data, they're actually increasing congestion in particular in transit deserts, and both in terms of geography, sort of where there isn't any transit, and also time of day when transit service is poor. So, and the folks using those are largely well-educated, folks making over $100,000 a year, mostly white and mostly urban. So we have to, I agree, think about the tools at our disposal. Most of them involve some kind of pricing, to incentivize and disincentivize the kinds of trips that we think are a good fit. Because I think that there can be a very positive symbiotic relationship between public transit and TNCs, but it's not happening right now. And as long as cities are cut out of the loop of either getting the data or having the regulatory tools to sort of guide the system the way that we would like, then I think we're going to struggle. We're going to be in this adverse relationship. There's going to be a ton of fear, which is exactly right. We're not going to get to that point of collaboration. It's going to be a missed opportunity, I think, for everybody, including first and foremost the folks who would benefit the most from having that choice.
So I think we'll do one more moderated panel question, and then we'll open it up to all of you to pepper the panelists with your own questions. I'm running out of questions because they're just answering all the questions that I want to ask before I ask them. Something, the organization I work for is Investing in Place, and we analyze policy through an equity frame, but we are increasingly more excited about the just growth equity framework, which sort of doesn't promote equity because it's the right thing to do, but because it's actually an economically sound thing to do for the region, for everybody, for people of all incomes, of all races, of all kinds. And so I guess my question to the panel is to arm this whole room to be advocates for gender matched planning and transportation choices that serve women as well as men and the whole gender gamut. Is there an economic argument, or can we make some economic-based points about why planning transportation around the needs of women that may be different from the needs of men travelers is good for male travelers, is good for the system as a whole, and quite frankly, to take the "you're being so emotional" response out of the equation?
Too emotional to drive a stick shift, as we learned earlier. It's so complicated. It's like math. Well, I will say this. I mean, one of the points that I like to make repeatedly is that, you know, Los Angeles is one of the least affordable cities in the country now when you compare the cost of housing to wages, and when you look at the number of opportunities that are available to you within an hour in a car versus an hour on transit, there's really no comparison. I mean, I think it's like an order of magnitude of 12 times as many opportunities and jobs as you can get to, which means that owning and paying for a vehicle, which is by far one of the most expensive and least efficient ways to get around, becomes a necessity if you want to provide for your family in Los Angeles. And increasingly that means that you can't be in Los Angeles anymore, right? Because you can't afford to live here, and the cost of transportation is crushing because it's not realistic, as Professor pointed out over and over again, to do all the things we need to do, and to lift our economic mobility rests on this crushing household expense. And so until we can get to a system that really provides extremely cost-effective ways for everybody to get around at the times they need to get around and the places they need to go, we're going to see a lot of the things that we care about in our city disappear. It's diversity, it's generosity, it's hospitality, it's opportunity. Those things are going to slip out of reach. And eventually, you know, we'll get to a place where they are out of reach for everybody except for the wealthiest among us. And I don't think that's good for an economy that relies on a strong, thriving middle class to support all of the things that we have to offer in terms of retail and everything else. And it's not a good thing for the future of the city and kind of our strength and our creativity if that sort of gets watered down or disappears. So if we lose a creative class and we lose a middle class because we created a system that relies on an expensive way of getting around, I think we all lose.
Oh, I'm in the amen corner. Go ahead.
I'm happy to talk. Okay, so so cars are expensive to buy and to own and to operate. So there's no question about that. And I think that it was one of the questions that someone had posed to us before this session about data that we don't have. We do have a lot of data. We could use data from Uber and Lyft for sure, right? So there's a lot of data we don't have. I mean, the real question about the costs of automobile ownership is whether you can't talk about costs without also talking about benefits. I'm sure every single one of you knows this, right? They go hand in hand. And we're not 100% certain what that is. So there's a very large and growing literature, very robust, about the relationship between having an automobile and all that access that Seleta just talked about, it offers, and actual economic outcomes. Okay, so going back to the question about economic outcomes, that's a very robust literature. Economists, planners, geographers, I mean, there's a whole list of scholars that have worked on that. Okay, and I know it's hard to say. I teach in a planning program. Okay, most of our students are planning for cycling and transit and all of that, but that is just not disputable. Okay, it is just not disputable at this point. But the question is, it does come with costs, and so over time, do the benefits outweigh the costs of automobile ownership? And those costs, as we know, are out-of-pocket costs, right? So all of those, but they're also the environmental costs, the costs associated with congestion, all of that. That's a question mark, okay? So I'll be honest, we need to do more analysis to take a look at that, okay? But the link between cars and the likelihood of getting a job, okay, or earnings, that is not a question at this point. And in a different audience where there are fewer transportation planners and more folks working for legal aid or social services, they do not argue on that point. Okay, I just want to say, all right? But in general, going back to that economic connection, there is no question. Here I'm talking about not just cars, but I'm talking about the whole package of transportation, okay? There's a very strong association. We're not just cruising in these vehicles or going up and down on transit, even though our kids might like, buses and trains. We're using transportation to get to opportunities. And that is a very important link. So when we're talking about, the connection between transportation and a robust economy, I think that also is not disputable, okay? That is just essential. It's the backbone. It's the way that we access everything that we do in our lives, whether on foot, in a car, transit, bike. So. That's it.
Thank you. Sticking with the amen.
Yeah,
Okay.
double amen.
Okay, well, thank you. I want to definitely thank Seleta, Evelyn, and Stephanie for their brilliance. I've heard you all present at some point or another in my life, and every time I hear it again, I'm like, wow, she knew that thing that nobody else in the room knew. That's amazing. So before any of you get to ask questions, I'm going to pause for a round of applause for our panelists. And I guess we'll just do popcorn style. If your hand goes up, I'm going to face this way because my back has been unintentionally towards the side of the room most of the night. But
Run the mic rules.
please do. And if you could just say your name for the panelists, please.
Hi, my name is Madeline. I'm going to give you a little bit of context for this question. My vice is Supervisor Kuehl. She is the vice chair of the Metro Board. And for better or worse, to my fellow board deputies, we are now in budget season. And so that always brings up fare box recovery, who we're building a system for. Are we building a system for our current transit-dependent riders? As Stephanie mentioned, we're lost 20 million boarders since 2014. So I like the idea of doing fares, as they do in many other countries, off-peak hours versus peak hours. We have one of the lowest fares, or the lowest fare, for the size of our transit system in the country. And so how do we balance the need to keep our current riders attracting choice riders when you have many trips without punishing, and particularly important to my boss, punishing people who are making multiple trips, people who are taking off-peak trips. So how do you kind of do that with the fare question and balancing Metro's budget and still expanding the system? So, sorry. You should have let me go first.
I was legally required to answer. Her name is also Madeline.
Professor Taylor. Isn't that a question for you, Professor Taylor? That wasn't for me, Madeline, right?
We talked about that earlier.
Yeah, exactly. So it's for the rest
I think everybody would really like to hear what you talked about.
I warned you, I sent you a text.
Oh my goodness, she did say she was going to heckle. Well, I think it is like the big question that is before our policymakers and our agency. And in fact, we're following Seleta's lead. Probably in the next few weeks.
I love it when she says that.
Yes, we are. We're in the next few weeks. We will be releasing a draft strategic plan for our agency, and we will have it out for public review and comment for about 30 days or so. And it is informed by, I think, over 120 stakeholder interviews, including an interview with Miss Seleta Reynolds. But I think it's to help kind of set the vision for what Metro should be, what type of agency it should be, because there are trade-offs, there are issues as to what purpose is Metro going to provide given the needs. And this is significant for our agency because we have not had an agency-wide strategic plan for more than a decade or so, right? And given all the changes that are going on in our industry and the needs in LA County, can you imagine moving forward as an agency without having a clear roadmap and vision to guide you? So it's a really significant effort. I encourage everyone to comment on it when it's released. But it is a challenge for us because we understand that the nature of transportation and particularly transit is totally changing because of these external forces, really driven by technology, but with ride-hailing, microtransit, autonomous vehicles, we cannot be the same transit agency that we were 25 years ago. So to be continued, the discussion, because there are some folks who think we should just offer free fares to everyone. So we'll have to continue the dialogue on that.
Well, and I think it's, transit agencies, and LADOT is the sort of largest municipal operator of transit in LA County, and we're very proud of the system that we run and operate. Our fares are 50 cents, and we lost riders when we doubled our fare from a quarter to 50 cents. We lost riders, right? Because that's who's riding the system. Even though you can get a discount if you use a tap card, most of our patrons still pay in cash because it is what they are coins, because it's what they can scrape together to get on to our buses. But I think that we're all under a lot of regulatory, a regulatory framework that disallows the kind of creativity and iterative learning that the private sector gets to do. So we have to run lines that are extremely inefficient and extremely expensive on a per trip basis because of rules that were written for a system, that doesn't exist in today's world, where it was the only system and the only choice. And when can we get to a place where, as transit agencies, we can be concessioners of public transit? Maybe we don't have to operate every single line, but that public transit means, electric bikes, and it means EV car sharing, and it means, microtransit, and it means bus rapid transit, and it means subway and light rail, and that we're packaging those things together in a way that's really affordable because we're able to deliver the system more efficiently. Because a lot of the actors, the private actors in the mobility space right now are not mobility companies, right? The free-floating bike share companies, Uber and Lyft, these are not mobility companies, they are data companies. And they're building empires in this new economic reality that we are not ready for. And that if we rely on those companies to provide those services and don't get in that game, we're gonna be in a situation where those services, people rely on them, we cut service, and then they disappear overnight. And so, they don't have the same economics that we do, but we have the power of convening, concessioning, and regulating. And now, thanks to the voters in LA County, we've got real money. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to sort of rethink the structure and rethink our role as sort of how we're providing this whole suite of services so that we can cut back on some of these things that are killing us, right? And we'll never be able to provide the service that we want if we exist under that framework.
In the back.
Hi, my name is Mehmet, and so not a planner, and if all the planners in this room obviously know the answer to this question, they can howl me down, but I have a specific question, and hopefully it'll touch on something that Seleta just kind of brought up tangentially, which is at the moment the city is renegotiating the terms of the JC Deco contract that governs street furniture and
That's
bus
the Bureau of
stops.
Street Services. I don't know anything about that.
Right, for sure. But like,
Sore point.
so I guess, as I understand it, this is a renegotiation for 10 years, and like when I'm out in the system, I don't see a system. Y'all talked about bus shelters, lighting, design. I don't see a system that necessarily has taken women into mind, and so I don't necessarily know if these negotiations going on currently are taking women into mind, and then do we get a situation where for 10 years we're locked into something that hasn't taken women into mind? And I think the part that is the more general question is kind of like you said, like if there's private operators that are coming into the space, what can the public do to kind of make sure that those private operators could hopefully have some sort of standards from a regulatory perspective? Or if that's not the case, what do we do as members of the public to influence private operators to also take these things into account? So that's it.
So I will stay away from a deeply considered rant about where street furniture ought to live in the city of Los Angeles at the moment, and just say I have not been engaged in those negotiations, so I don't know the answer to your question. I do know that primarily those decisions are revenue decisions, and so they don't always get us the outcomes that we want in terms of serving the city in an equitable way from a variety of different lenses. But to your question about what can you and the public do and think about, pay attention, right? There is a bill in the US Senate right now that would completely preempt cities and states from any kind of regulatory role around autonomous vehicles, including being able to regulate the cleanliness of those vehicles, right? It might gut or undermine the Clean Air Act. We might not be able to do VMT pricing that we want to do because the industry is writing the rule book, and the needs and considerations of the public are not there. The California DMV just passed a rule that you do not have to have a carbon-based life form behind the wheel of a vehicle in order to test and deploy autonomous vehicles in California starting April 1st, and you don't have to really ask anybody's permission, right? You can just roll your autonomous whatever it is down the streets of LA without talking to or engaging the city in any way, shape, or form. These are decisions being made by elected officials that are going to directly affect the way that we are able to safely move around the city now and in the future. And they're happening now, and they are not being written with the public in mind. So I think that's the opportunity, is to be attentive and to advocate for the kinds of things that we really care about. Now, I'll say that our California senators have been some of the few that have put a hold on that bill to try and take some of these things into consideration. But we're talking about April. And we're talking about 2019, when Amazon Air and Walmart Air are going to start flying hundreds of drones in our airways. And that the Federal Aviation Administration is now regulating down to the blade of grass in front of your house. Right? These are all things that are happening, and cities and states are being cut out of the conversation. And I think that the only way that will change is with really thoughtful advocacy and sustained advocacy from the electorate.
Can we do 1, 2, 3?
Hi, my name's Allison. Something I was thinking about and listening to this, and for some context, I almost got hit by a male aged 18 to 40 walking from my house on Sunset to Vermont and Sunset to take the red line here. And you know, as we're talking about planning and transit and women's safety and all this stuff, but we're also having kind of the pedestrians becoming illegal entities in the streets, you know, where it's just passing. You can't be on your cell phone or you're going to get fined and jaywalking. Is planning keeping in mind, you know, Metro, whomever, the pedestrian aspect of all of this and what's going on in our safety and, you know, how we're going to get onto these buses, whether it's platforms or what else? Is that something that's being thought about?
Well, it is being thought about now at Metro. I will give a shout out to Jessica Meany and Investing in Place. They helped Metro really look at both pedestrian and bicycle or active transportation as a critical part of our mobility kind of footprint. And so as part of updating our travel demand modeling, we will, for the first time, be incorporating a pedestrian element to that modeling effort.
I'll just put in a plug for our students. So we have a lot of students who are interested in just that question, and they've been doing a whole variety of studies related to pedestrians and safety, so the impact of road diets, those kinds of things. So to try to get a handle on some of those questions. I can't speak for Metro, but on the, you know, on the academic side, that there's a lot of research going on in precisely that area.
First, last mile. I'm sorry, the mayor's office is signaling me to say, and first, last mile. First mile, last mile. Thank you very much.
Yes. I'll also give the mayor's, Mayor Garcetti, you know, issued an executive directive around something called Vision Zero, which is a goal to get to zero traffic deaths in LA by 2025. Half of the people who are getting killed on the streets are people biking and walking, mostly people walking, and a disproportionate representation of kids and older adults. And when we know how to make the streets safer, we need to make the streets slower. But when we go in to a neighborhood and try and make some of those changes, it's incredibly challenging because it feels like we are challenging a fundamental sort of value in Southern California, which is sort of the right to be able to go as far as you want, as fast as you want, whenever you want. And that requires sort of sustained attention and advocacy again from your neighbors and folks who can come out and say, that's actually not what we want in our neighborhood, and we want to try something different so that I can feel safe, you know, walking to the red line. I was just at USDOT, and the deputy undersecretary got up in front of a whole room and said, these are our core values for transportation. We want to go far, fast, cheap. And I was just like, wow, nope. But that's a federal perspective, right? And it's a widely shared, I think viewpoint. And so these are changes really challenging, but it's absolutely necessary if we really care about keeping people safe no matter how they travel.
Maybe right here, and
Hi, I'm Brian, and I want to.
Oh, you just Brian?
I want to call out and ask what we can do to try and get better data to do planning with the growth of TNCs. It's just really an issue. Every time I get a chance, I try and push for that. But there has to be a concerted effort. We can't engage in intelligent planning unless we have better data on that. But that's not my question. My question is to try and tie something that all of you put together, and we sort of got a story about how there are these for reasons that are somewhere between embarrassing and troubling. There's enormous burden in the household, disproportionately across the nation, on women to do a lot of household serving travel in addition to being in the labor market. We see that there's tremendous effort on the transportation side to urbanize a place like Los Angeles. A place it would bring destinations closer together, to make it easier to actually walk and bike and take transit between destinations. And we see tremendous forces, economic forces, for urbanization in the region. And yet, often on the basis of concern about traffic impacts, we have a huge affordable housing crisis, and I'm surprised that didn't come up more as an issue. That the the economic forces to build a lot more housing in already built-up areas are enormous, and the political forces restraining that are enormous as well, which is of course forcing people to live farther from where they'd like to travel to, which is making a car more of a necessity, which is undermining huge investments that we're making in public transit. So, this is mostly a transportation group, and I'm wondering if the panelists might comment a little bit on the behind all of this, the affordable housing crisis, and how it may be putting extra burdens on women who then are need to be in a car to be doing all the things that they have to do.
Well, we agree at Metro. It's a significant issue. It is impacting our ridership and providing, affecting our ability to provide the service to folks who need it the most. So I believe within the last 4 or 5 years, our board set a policy that for all of our property that we'd conduct joint development on, that we'd have a portfolio goal of at least 35% affordable housing beyond the joint developments that we put forward. And over the last 10 years, when we looked countywide of the new affordable housing units that had been built, the majority of them were around our transit stations. We think that is critical because, as you've said, those are our riders, and yet we have this kind of policy tension where we're providing the service, particularly the light rail, the train service to communities that need it, and yet the riders that we want to serve then are pushed out because of the increase in rents. Our board also, within the last year or so, introduced this new approach, and this is what we're calling a match fund, a housing fund, where we're partnering with local nonprofit housing agencies to really help try to retain affordable housing in addition to our joint development portfolio. But we see it as a critical issue. When you see the draft strategic plan released over the next few weeks, you'll see that this gentrification issue and affordable housing we identify as a critical issue for us.
It is a really important issue. I mean, so going back to the point that was made about spatial access to opportunities by transit versus automobiles, that narrows in high density neighborhoods where there are a lot of destinations in close proximity. So if we are pushing people to the outer periphery of the metropolitan area, it makes it more difficult. I had talked about the one spouse with the complicated patterns, using the automobile and the other using other modes. But if you're in a very dispersed environment because you're forced there because there's not affordable housing in and around the central parts of the city, it makes even that division very, very difficult. So affordable housing is going to be a key part of the mix. And here I'm just trying to link it back to the transportation and gender issues, but clearly there's a broader issue about affordable housing. There's no question about that.
Yeah, and I think we've done a pretty lackluster job of integrating land use and transportation planning just sort of globally in both of those, both the transportation planning world and land use planning world. Vince Bertoni, who's the director of city planning, jokingly calls me his work spouse because he wants to better integrate and marry, see how I did that? Marry transportation and planning together. And we have what I'll politely describe as disparate views on the current bill that is Scott Wiener put forward around density around transit corridors, because I feel from being a consultant and also working in cities that the hammer that local folks use to keep dense affordable housing from coming into neighborhoods is always transportation. And as lucky as we are that the state is trying to take that hammer away in a CEQA environment, there's no doubt in my mind that it will continue to be a political hammer, and that transportation is the wedge being used to prevent a lot of these zoning decisions from being made. And until we do a better job communicating, particularly to a broader spectrum than the folks who typically can afford to show up to an evening meeting on a weeknight or a council meeting during the day on a weekday. Until we can better communicate how all of these things are linked together to our sort of combined future, we're going to continue to have that shoving match, and that's why I think it is valuable for the state to have a role in saying we're going to pull some of these decisions up out of the local level and assert those things at a sort of a statewide level. I'm not sure that Scott Wiener's bill is the right way, but it's at least opening up a conversation, because until we do that, we're really going to get nowhere.
So I think this will be our last question.
Yeah, they're all just planning. I mean, they're fine. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ari. Nice to see you. So in some cities around the world, I'm most familiar with Mexico cities, but I know it's in Brazil, it's in Japan. A lot of major transportation systems have women-only passenger cars as a way to really combat sexual violence and harassment on their systems. And I think it's really interesting, especially in now the Me Too era and with Time's Up, and as we're finally really societally trying to take a hard line against sexual harassment, to maybe create that kind of separation. Is that something that you think would make sense in Los Angeles and would make sense on your systems here?
There was a pretty humorous story that actually ran just this week about Japan's women-only cars where men rush in, right? So it was, absolutely, groping and unwanted advances, huge problem in their subway system, and so they created these women-only cars. But unless you have somebody there making sure to enforce that protection, they maybe don't always work as intended, particularly. If you don't have enough women to fill up a woman-only car sometimes, then it becomes this thing that's not self-enforcing. So I think it's an interesting idea. I mean, we don't have a rail system, so I don't know that it would make sense on our Dash buses, although that would be cool. Maybe Commuter Express, just for ladies. All kinds of services on those things. Actually, there is a transit system in Boston where you could take a spin class on the bus on the way into work. Yes, and I would consider that. But I think a lot of times, it requires a whole spectrum of things in order for it to work. And so I would want to make sure that if we did move in that direction, we were really thoughtful about not just putting a sticker on a car, but actually doing it in a deep and meaningful way that made women feel welcome.
I would say we have put it on the table to look at because this issue is so significant, but as Seleta's outlined some of the challenges, so we don't know if we'll officially go there, but it's something we're going to look at.
So I think that's, we're out of time. Please join me in thanking our fabulous panelists. We're trying to keep you here to keep the conversation going. So there is some lovely snacks, and we have coffee and iced tea and water. So please stay and join and chat. And thank you very much for coming.